Welcome to our roundtable. It's fabulous to see so many of you dialed in on a Monday evening in London. I guess some of you are probably, I would imagine, based in New York or on the East Coast, so lunchtime. I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the US and Americas program here at Chatham House, where I'm also Dean of our Academy. I'm really excited about tonight's roundtable discussion. It's hard to imagine a better topic, American grand strategy in the international world order. It's hard to imagine a better time to have the conversation, and it's really hard to imagine a better set of participants to speak to these topics. Tonight's roundtable is jointly hosted by LSE Ideas and by Chatham House, the US and Americas program. That's something I'm also really excited about, since I'm also affiliated with LSE Ideas and an LSE alum. So I'm very fond of the place and really excited that we can do some work together. We have three really tremendous speakers. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to be speaking with us. The first is Professor Alexander Cooley, who is the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and Director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University in New York City, which is where he is currently sitting. Alex has written many books. His writings, I'm sure, are well known to any of you who work on international security, international relations, Central Asia, Russia. He is here this evening because he has co-authored a book with Dan Nexon, who is also speaking, called Exit from Hegemony, The Unraveling of the American Global Order. I think well-timed, even if, of course, they're likely to be wrong. No, we'll see. But very well-timed and a really important book. Alex is also a graduate of the American School in London. He spent his high school years based in the UK, a very different era. But he returns often and is part of the Lloyd George study group on world order that we convened with Council on Foreign Relations in Georgetown. So he's been to Chatham House recently. He will be followed by Rebecca Listener, who is at the US Naval War College. She's assistant professor, and she is author of this book. I shall hold it up: An Open World: How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order. So I think we've clearly signaled that we have a robust debate ahead of us. Rebecca is speaking, I should say, in her personal capacity, as she is not speaking on behalf of the US Naval War College or the US government. A very important point to note for anybody who works at the Naval War College. Rebecca is, of course, prolific in her speaking and her writing. And I'm really excited to have Rebecca here at Chatham House virtually and hopefully soon in person. And last and never least is Professor Dan Nexon, who is a professor of government at Georgetown University and also in the School of Foreign Service. He has written prolifically, has been the editor of International Studies Quarterly, has driven our thinking in international relations for many years. I should say that Alex and Dan and I did our PhDs together too, so there's a lot of history there, and so I'm especially excited. I'm going to kick it up and turn it over to you pretty quickly, Dan. American Grand Strategy, International World Order, and Exit from Hegemony. A lot of people here, I think, feel like, you know, there's a lot of power. There's a lot of power in the United States, but there's certainly not a lot of leadership. So perhaps you could tell us, you know, first of all, the age-old question: is this Donald Trump or is this a long time coming? And to the extent that it's both, what can we expect? And especially, I guess, what can we expect, those of us sitting here in Europe wondering what to make of America's engagement as we go forward? And tell us about the book.
Okay, so Dan, but I take it I'll kick this off. So we have written this book called Exit from Hegemony. And first of all, thank you so much to you, LSE Ideas, Chatham House, for hosting this. And it's also wonderful to be on the panel with Rebecca. We wrote this book specifically with the whole question of Trump in mind, but in some ways to make a counterpoint to Trump. That is, we are identifying a number of trends that predated Donald Trump's administration and are likely to continue after his administration, right? And the baseline argument, as the book's title says, is that it's over, right? The era of American hegemony, American primacy American leadership over the international order that peaked in the 1990s till about the early 2000s is unraveling. And Donald Trump has certainly played a role, a big role as it turns out, but our argument is that he is more of an accelerant, right, of these existing dynamics rather than the root cause. So I want to give you a taste of some of the arguments from the book, and then I think Dan is going to extend that out in a slightly different direction looking forward. So we identify three areas in which these trends are much different now than they were when the US was dominant in the 1990s. What we call first exit from above. And here we focus specifically on China and Russia, both in their roles as emerging or rising powers, but in terms of the counter-ordering infrastructure that they're providing. By that, I mean the types of regional organizations that they have created and are leading, the types of agendas that they are setting in existing organizations, as well as the kinds of new types of blocks that they're generating to try and push back against transatlantic consensus. So regional organizations, we all know, of course, about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but also in terms of Russian initiatives like the CSTO, the Eurasian Economic Union, we have this fabric now that is multilateral, but it's not liberal, right? These bodies tend to embody norms that are, if not illiberal, not prominently focused on principles of universality or liberal democracy. Sometimes, as in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they explicitly push back against the universalism of the liberal order. And the overall argument is not that these organizations are necessarily effective or that Russia is exerting everything that it wants in the former Soviet space through these, but rather that they are creating a denser fabric of the international order that is China and Russia centered to compete with the US and Western centered one, right? And so that also means greater connections amongst these regional organizations, overall dissemination of norms from these organizations to the United Nations, overall a lot more contestation than we had before in multilateralism. The second point, which I will not get into as much because it's relatively familiar, is we now see other countries providing public goods in the system, right? It used to be that the US had monopoly patronage, right? Which means if you wanted development assistance, if you wanted emergency loans, if you wanted an international body to sign off on the quality of your elections, there was no choice. You actually had to go to the US or US influenced international institutions. Now there are lots of choices. We've talked a lot about Chinese development assistance, the Belt and Road, but also in all of these areas, we see new emerging powers, Saudi Arabia, Russia to a certain extent, providing alternative patronage, economic and political goods for the smaller states, right? And I can get into that a little more. And then finally, we see contested transnationalism. In the 1990s, in academia and in the policy world, we had a kind of very stylized view of transnational politics. We revered the NGO sector. We thought that liberal activists could go beyond borders, that they were nimbler than states, that they were a little more agile, more clever, and that they would spread norms from the north to the south, from west to east in areas like gender equality, human rights, environmental protections, and so forth. Well, a couple of things have happened. One is authoritarians have figured out, actually, they can pretty much squelch out activists. Right? They can put restrictions on NGOs. They can ban them. They can ban their sources of foreign funding. They can just criminalize them, as was the case of the Russian Federation. And accompanying that, to go with the theme of contestation, you've seen the rise of transnational illiberal networks, right? So groups like the World Congress of the Families that emphasize the family, opposes reproductive rights, and is the fusion of a couple of Christian right organizations in the US meeting up with international foreign financing, a lot of it from the Eurasian region, and then having annual conferences in places like Hungary, Moldova, Verona last time around, and networking with these right-wing movements. So the point being that Trump has, of course, political preferences that align with some of these contested spheres. So for instance, Trump's ambassadorial appointments in Europe are very much of figures who support illiberal parties in these countries. The Netherlands, Germany, certainly Hungary, and this creates a really interesting situation where the transnationalism that is undermining the liberal order is actually in part being supported by the executive branch of the US. So I think all of these three spheres are going to be contested. Yes, a Biden administration could potentially try and solidify policies in all of these three areas, but the fundamental dynamics aren't going to change in terms of the ecology being a lot denser right now. The final point I'll make is, even if we can get some consensus now on where US foreign policy needs to go to shore up some of the ordering mechanisms that might be desirable from a US perspective, right, and to stop the unraveling, it's going to be very difficult to do domestically, both because of political polarization, but also what we've seen, and here I do think Trump is more of a cause than an accelerant on the domestic side, the potential for domestic foreign policy to be open to influence and a kind of political clientelism that we see. And we see this especially with the relationship with Saudi Arabia, arguably with the UAE, that is the bypassing of certain agencies, such as the State Department or the interagency framework, and instead personal ties between administration officials and these countries determining really big shifts in US policy, right? And so I think that is more problematic looking forward, because even if US credibility can be rebuilt in terms of what it stands for and its commitments, the alliances and so forth, this idea that there is a bypass, right? Because it's the executive that sets the foreign policy that might be susceptible to influence is something that I think is out there for a time being. So those are my kind of disparate thoughts. I wish I could be a little more optimistic. In the end, some of these developments may not be all that bad, and that's a separate issue that I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. But I do think the idea that there is a return to normal ordering, I just don't see that happening. Thank you.
That's great, Dan. Alex, sorry. We're going to come to you, Dan, after we talk to Rebecca. I know you'll say a lot more about the book, but I think it's good to maybe mix it up a little bit. Rebecca, we're in a much more competitive space. The ecology has changed. There's more on offer. And even if the US wanted to return or could return domestically, it would be unsustainable. Is that your take?
Well, so first of all, Leslie, thanks so much for having me, and to Chatham House and to LSE. And it's really an honor to appear alongside Dan and Alex, whose book I really, really enjoyed and would highly recommend, and from whom I've learned so much, including from Dan, who was actually one of my dissertation committee members. So I think it's pretty clear to all of us who've been following international news over the course of this year, and indeed over the course of the past several years, that COVID has revealed an international order that is on the brink of collapse. We have international institutions that are totally inadequate to the transnational problems that we face. Cooperation is elusive, and great powers, especially the US and China, are increasingly at loggerheads with each other. But like Alex and Dan, albeit for different reasons, I want to argue that this damage began long before the pandemic, and that the forces responsible will be with us even if Donald Trump leaves office in January of 2021. And I'll also go further to argue that there is a way that the US can win this contest for 21st century order. Indeed, if we are to recover from the present crisis, Washington needs to embrace a new global strategy, a strategy that both rejects nationalism and nostalgia, and instead embraces forward-looking American leadership in defense of what I call in the book an open world. So let me make 3 points that draw upon the book that Leslie mentioned, An Open World, which is co-authored with Mira Rapp-Hooper, who couldn't join us here today, but is very much a partner in all of this. So the first point is that to renovate international order for the 21st century, we have to begin by acknowledging that the liberal international order of the post-Cold War era is a thing of the past, and its successor will look entirely different in scope, substance, and membership. And in many ways, unparalleled American power after the Soviet Union fell, the condition that we know as American primacy, conditioned us to think of international order as a single universal entity underpinned by common values. This was reflected in the idea that history had ended and that liberalism would ultimately reign supreme. And in many ways, that was the core wager of the liberal international order, and it has now been thoroughly discredited for many of the reasons that Alex already discussed, but also under the mounting pressures of Trump and COVID, long-term power shifts, which I'll go into in more detail, technological change, and American political dysfunction. And we know historically that international orders always change when power shifts. And the key trend that I would highlight is the fact that power has been shifting for a long time now. American primacy was already waning before COVID as west to east power shifts and technological change were fueling China's rise. And that was already undermining a US-led order that simply no longer reflected the global distribution of power. China's economy is now the world's largest by many measures, and its military has risen in parallel and grown in parallel, which has complicated American military strategy in the Indo-Pacific already. And although China rose within a US-led order, it now seeks to change the terms of that order to better reflect its own power and preferences. And we've seen this, yes, in the institutional space, but I would argue much more consequentially in the ways in which China has tried to alter the Asian regional order by militarizing the South China Sea and trying to turn it into a Chinese lake. But it's not just these power shifts. And I would underline that this is much more about China in my view than it is about Russia, but I imagine we'll talk about that more later. It's also technological change, because the liberal international order is growing increasingly outmoded as innovation is proceeding at a rapid pace and requiring new forms of international governance that have simply not been forthcoming. And everywhere from cyberspace to internet to AI and automation, we just don't have any meaningful rules and regimes in these spaces. And the China theme and the tech theme actually converge because as technological ordering itself becomes a theater of great power competition, China is trying to write rules that protect its domestic model of techno-authoritarianism. And the US and the West has thus far not been able to mount any kind of effective response. So the second point I want to make is that China's rise as an authoritarian power within the international order means that the liberal international order simply can't endure. But what it doesn't mean is that we have to succumb to a world defined by closed spheres of influence. So recognizing that liberal universalism has run its course, the US can still advance a new approach to international order in concert with its allies and partners, and that is the pursuit of an open world. And an open world would seek to keep the world open and to promote open and transparent interactions between states. That means first that all states should be able to make free and independent political choices without foreign interference in their domestic decision-making or outright domination by more powerful nations. It means second that international waterways, airspace, and outer space must remain open and accessible for commercial and military transit. So countries like China should not be allowed to dominate the South China Sea. And third, global cooperation should proceed through international institutions that are governed transparently and modernized for 21st century challenges. And like I said, when you think about the real threats to openness, China emerges as really the only country that both has preferences for closure and the means to bring that about. And yes, it's possible that Chinese-sponsored international institutions may be a vehicle for Chinese hierarchical domination, but there are other vehicles as well, like the construction of 5G digital networks or even outright territorial conquest. So I'll conclude just by making a brief third point, which is that I actually think we have a tremendous opportunity right now, and that opportunity will not come again. We are today, I think, at the most consequential world ordering moment that we've faced since at least 1991 and perhaps since 1945. The US has a small and narrowing window to revamp its foreign policy, to abandon its post-Cold War hubris in favor of a new strategy that is both disciplined and globally engaged. Because the fact is that America remains extraordinarily powerful, and with political will, it can turn our present moment of destruction into a moment of creation. But if it fails to do so, the results could be dire. Authoritarian rivals like China may consolidate their power, resulting in a world that's more hostile to American interests and values. And I think we've seen quite clearly that without American leadership on global challenges like COVID, this pandemic may prove a mild harbinger of much worse disorder to come. So I will leave it there and look forward to hearing from Dan and to the discussion.
Dan, looking forward to your comments, not only on the book, but on what Rebecca had to say and where we're going.
So let me just use my time and hopefully not natter on for too long to lay down a couple of markers that maybe for how we might, for the Q&A or for how we might get some sources of agreement and disagreement among not just Alex and me and Rebecca, but maybe even between Alex and me. So I wanted to so when we talk about grand strategy, one of the crucial things that we really mean is we mean an identification of what the crucial, the central, the key security challenges are for a state, and then how it ought to respond to those. And one of the things I think that is fairly clear from looking at debates in the United States about grand strategy is that we don't have a consensus on a sensible, clear hierarchy of those security challenges. And that's for a variety of reasons, some of which are ideological differences, some of which is that we don't agree on that in the United States, we don't even agree on whether or not certain kinds of things are happening or are threats. Part of it is that we have a lot of American security and national security apparatus is geared towards certain kinds of challenges and has been geared towards those challenges for 20 years. Terrorism, the rise of new great power, the emerging so-called emerging revisionist great powers. And part of it is that I think we still haven't quite adjusted to what it would mean to be a global great power that is not a global hegemon, right? And so part of the problem that we have is that we tend to either look at our alternatives as being the United States as a has-been of history, or it dominates everything. And the in-between space is very hard for us to wrap our minds around. And that's one of the great benefits of Rebecca and Mira's book. So as I see it, there are two major classes of security threats that we would call existential to the United States. Truly potentially threatening to the integrity of the US as the United States republic, right? And I mean that in a broad sense of the term. The first are a set of things that are primarily global commons challenges. Probably the most familiar to people is climate change, but also global pandemics, potentially the spread of nuclear capability and certain kinds of weapons of mass destruction. And these are problems that, generally speaking, require robust, sustained international cooperation among both liberal and illiberal states to address. Again, I don't want to go into too much granular detail right now, but climate change is a really good example of this because there is no way you can tackle or mitigate carbon emissions or global warming or any of the kinds of effects that we're starting to see now, which are transnational both in source and in effect, without engaging in serious cooperation between China, the United States, Russia, a number of other petroleum producers, and so on and so forth. The second class of really big security threats right now are, I would broadly classify as threats to the integrity of the US political system as a system. And by that, I mean the liberal democratic character of the United States domestic political order. And these take two forms that, as we argue in the book, are actually quite related to one another. One is the threat of corruption, both in terms of the role of money and undue influence in the US domestically, but also in terms of transnational flows of finances and resources and cash that have a profoundly corrupting effect on US political economy and on US political processes. So if you wanted, I think there's no sort of simpler example of this than if you look at Paul Manafort and some of the people surrounding Donald Trump in his 2016 run, who are deeply implicated in this transnational web of global cash, that essentially kleptocratic money that was looted from places like Ukraine, post-Soviet space, and then diverted into, then money laundered internationally, taking advantage of international capital mobility, and ultimately finding small portions of it, but still a ton of money for, say, a lobbying operation in the United States into the hands of US politicians and US influence peddlers, right? And that has had a tremendous, I think, corrupting influence on the ability of the US system to be democratically responsive. The second, and as I've suggested, related, I won't really go into detail about exactly why, but some of you will know, is the rise of reactionary illiberal movements and transnational reactionary illiberal movements. That is, movements and parties that reject fundamental aspects of domestic, liberal, democratic, and open orders, civic nationalist orders, inclusive orders, and even the sort of notion that the democratic process should be maximized in order to resolve political disputes. So tend to look at not just liberal rights as problematic, but also in some cases allowing democratic processes. So in the United States, for example, this takes the form of intense gerrymandering. It takes the form of voter suppression. It takes the form of manipulation of voter rolls and other efforts to essentially lock in minority rule. And we see these kinds of trends, even if they're not necessarily effectuated because the parties haven't come to power yet. We see these sort of on the kind of agenda of a lot of parties. We see this, of course, in Central Europe with the rise of urbanism, with the increasing democratic backsliding of law and justice. And these kinds of reactionary liberal movements are transnational in character. They are both manifested in Trumpism and the current government of the United States, but also manifested in other liberal democracies or increasingly less liberal democracies, and involve the hookup of these movements together. Now, the problem is that to tackle threats to the integrity of the US democratic system, both in the sort of transnational sense, in the sense of transnational reactionary movements, but also in the sense of the role of just cold hard cash in subverting democratic processes, you have to take actions to protect electoral integrity and to tackle global corruption that are necessarily threatening to illiberal regimes. Right, so you have to go after money laundering that has its origins in places like the post-Soviet states, Russia in particular. You have to address the Chinese, I think, are less interested in just subverting democracy, but they are interested in using their wealth to influence political processes, as we've seen in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and elsewhere. And to go after these kinds of capacities is to mount a threat to those regimes. In some ways, for example, in the Russian case, clearly an existential threat to the way that the regime functions. And in China, potentially a threat to the sort of authoritarian system that China has. And so there's an inherent trade-off between activities to protect the integrity of the Western liberal democratic processes and then the kinds of relations that you might need to tackle global commons problems. More broadly, because the primary existential threats to liberal democratic regimes in the United States and elsewhere are in these sort of transnational category, it means that the pursuit of something like the open world is necessarily threatening to other great powers. And so the trade-offs there are intense and difficult. There are also a set of secondary security issues, and these are ones that I think we're accustomed to thinking of primary just because of the habits of American foreign policy thought, right? And these are the interlinked questions of security of allies against would-be regional great powers, or against would-be regional hegemons, so Taiwan, Japan, et cetera, in East Asia, the Baltic states, other NATO powers in Western Eurasia vis-a-vis Russia. And this is a very traditional kind of set of concerns that the United States wants to avoid the emergence of a regional hegemon in another continental system that would be the basis then for would then allow the emergence of a new regional hegemon to pose a threat to the United States homeland or core US security interests in North America. And we think about this as sometimes we think about this in terms of offshore balancing or forward defense, but however we think about the means, we're talking about the same thing. So those, but that I would argue are crucial security issues, but they are actually secondary to the first two. If you want to think about actual lived imminent existential threats to US, the sort of integrity of the US system and the security of the American people, understood in terms not just of sort of life, but in terms of the American way of life. And I think we tend to actually invert those when we think about grand strategy. Because it's just, that's what we're used to doing. We're used to talking about great power competition. And the third claim, which I'm just going to lay a marker down for, I'm not going to develop any length of time, is that that related to this inversion of threats, we tend to, the big thing in the United States now that sort of seems to have broad spectrum buy-in from everybody who's not kind of on the further left is the idea that we are entering an era of great power competition. And this is the language used in the 2017 National Security Strategy, which was, of course, an attempt to sort of make heads or tails of sort of Trump foreign policy utterances and incorporate it into sort of more traditional conservative, realist, conservative nationalist worldviews. But it's also a set of terminology that has colonized a lot of discussion well beyond this attempt to articulate Trump foreign policy. It's also what a lot of Trump foreign policy veterans and people who are in the Republican Party who have not jumped ship from Trump, who are not part of the sort of neoconservative or traditional Republican internationalist establishment, never Trump community. It's what the people who are ambiguously related to Trump, ambivalently related to Trump, but have remained within the Republican fold. It's what they've seized on both to justify their own sort of involvement in the Trump administration and also to sort of salvage the legacy of a Trump foreign policy that they, I think, are generally still uncomfortable with, primarily in terms of its treatment of US allies. And I would just argue this is a work that sort of impinges on what Alex and I have done. It's a work that Ali Wan and I are a piece that we have that we're revising right now for Foreign Affairs, or for their online supplement, as it were. That great power competition is not a thing. It is not a paradigm. It is not a way of thinking about international politics. And that the logic of the great power competition paradigm essentially holds that we are entering into an era of great power competition as if that's some sort of structural, inevitable condition. And therefore, it is required that the US compete. And that US competition then has to be multi-spectrum, has to be in all areas in order to deal with the sort of the neo-Cold War, if you don't think of it as Cold War, the kind of rise of China and the threat that China poses to all kinds of threats. And there are all sorts of analytical and historical problems with this. There is no, for example, there is no period, for example, that lacks great power competition. And there is no one way of doing great power competition. So it never really made, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But the problem here that I would posit is that if we think about what it means for the US to be in relative decline, and what we think about the mix of threats, of needs, and if we think about the mix of competition that does exist between the United States and illiberal great powers, but also the need for cooperation, if we think about that in terms of a paradigm of great power competition, we can't, I think, make good judgments about how to balance these competing strategic priorities that I have laid out. And so the best way to understand, I think, what it means for the United States to be a global great power that is no longer a global hegemon is to understand that the United States needs to consider that things like competition, cooperation are all instruments that the United States can deploy. They're all strategies that the United States can deploy to realize its core security objectives, and that some of those core security objectives are much better suited to either cooperative relations with illiberal great powers or push back against other illiberal powers under conditions where we don't view wins and losses on issues as being catastrophic or existential threats to the United States, as long as we are concerned about these core matters of global commons problems and then the maintenance of liberal democracy in the United States and helping our allies maintain their own liberal democracy. And I'll end there.
That was great. There's a huge amount on the table. I'm going to start with a question. I'm going to take a question from Hans. We'll come back to the panel, and you can respond to each other when I come back to you. And then we're going to go straight out to everybody else. So please do raise your hands. I I guess a comment and a question. I mean, you know, the language of great power competition is pervasive, far beyond the US. It's, you know, pervasive, I would say, across the think tank world, the university world, certainly in the UK, across Europe, for trying to understand where we are and where we're going. I mean, I think the comment that you made about the US finding it difficult to think of being a great power, but not a hegemonic power. Yeah, I mean, but I would say that from the point of view of those of us sitting in the UK, it would be nice if if the US behaved like a normal great power, let alone, you know, never mind hegemony. I mean, anything would be good at this point. But in all seriousness, you know, really we've gotten through 3 very significant sets of arguments from 2 big books and a wealth of scholarship between the 3 of you. And we've said almost nothing about Europe, and we're sitting in the UK. So I'm just curious, you know, is that basically the hard, cold fact? I mean, you know, that at some level, you know, if you're trying to understand America's role in the world and where things are headed, for better and worse, there's a domestic story of illiberalism and what one might need to do to deal with that. There's a story about openness. And, you know, if Europe jumps on that bandwagon, great, but it could as well be Australia or Japan or South Korea or any other number of powers. You know, where does Europe sit in this, and where does the UK sit in this? And, you know, should we be emigrating? That's my question. Hans, over to you. And if you're unmuted already, so go ahead.
Thanks. Really interesting discussion. I have a question about liberalism, because all 3 of you use the word liberalism a lot. I felt that Alex in particular, you know, the word liberalism was doing a lot of work, it seems to me, in your argument, this sort of contrast between liberal powers and illiberal powers, but even more importantly, between a network of liberal institutions and illiberal institutions. And so I just want to unpack that a bit and try to understand in what sense, you know, you really mean this, because you know, I sort of understand the distinction between an authoritarian state and a democracy, but if you're talking about the liberal international order, it seems to me that it can be understood as liberal in at least 3 different senses, you know, an economic sense, a political sense, an IR sense. And so, you know, if these new institutions that are now emerging, driven by China and Russia, really are different, you know, if you take, for example, if we contrast, say, NATO, which is usually seen as being one of the, you know, most important parts of the liberal international order, and then on the other hand, you know, the SCO and the AIIB, in what sense really are the Chinese and Russian-led institutions illiberal and the Western-led ones are liberal?
Who wants to take a stab at that first? Rebecca, do you want to?
Sure, thanks. I'm happy to go first. So many great questions and provocations by Dan. Let me see if I can just offer sort of 3 observations fairly succinctly. So the first having to do with great power competition. I mean, I agree with Dan's critique in the sense that the notion of competition is infinitely zero-sum. It has no natural limits and therefore isn't a particularly helpful framework, except just to point out the fact that the United States is no longer the world's uncontested superpower and that we have a formidable challenge in the state of China. I think one of the great errors of the great power competition framework, as it was at least initially put forth by the Trump administration, has been the way in which it has conflated Russia and China. Because to my mind, they are very different threats that pose very different levels of challenges, not only to the US as a national security matter, but also to the international order. I think contra Alex's opening comments, I don't see most of Russian institutional entrepreneurship as being especially meaningful. And it certainly doesn't seem likely to be a vehicle for the type of hierarchical domination that might actually come about through the types of international institutions that Beijing is propagating, like BRI. Because quite simply, China just has so many more resources that it can put behind these initiatives, and I think a much more affirmative vision of the type of international order it wants to create, whereas Russia is far, far less powerful, all the more so with oil prices down and COVID running rampant, and it's really much more of a spoiler, I think, than an order builder in any real sense. But if we do acknowledge that there's some measure of rivalry, especially between the US and China, that's going forward, we need a framework to help us understand how we should respond to that and where Chinese initiatives actually are threatening to America's core interests and where they are not. And that's what the whole open world concept tries to do, because it distinguishes between those Chinese behaviors that might portend closed spheres of influence, like militarizing the South China Sea, and those types of Chinese behaviors that are in many ways the natural outgrowth of greater Chinese power and influence, like AIIB, which actually has been successfully nudged in the direction of openness and transparency through engagement. Even though the US boycotted it, some of our allies did not, and were able to actually change the character of the institution in a way that has become more open, even if it's not liberal. And I think that gets to my second point about why maybe seeing the world as liberal versus illiberal isn't exactly the right way to frame the set of strategic challenges that we face. And the reason is, first, that illiberal countries might propagate institutions that can actually be pushed in the direction of openness and good governance and aren't necessarily vehicles for exporting authoritarianism in every case. And again, I think AIIB is actually an interesting example of this, where it is a Chinese-founded development institution, but through a lot of external engagement and influence has actually been pushed in the direction of a development bank that doesn't pose any seeming acute threat to American interests. I think there's a much, much larger set of question marks around BRI and some of the other structures. But the other thing is, if the US is to counterbalance Chinese influence, including and especially in the areas where it matters, we need to work with illiberal countries. The US simply can't do it on its own, and it can't only work with other democracies. And this cuts two ways. On the one hand, you have democracies like India that are themselves illiberalizing and actually do share American preferences, for example, when it comes to the security order in the Indo-Pacific, but less so when it comes to certain matters of tech governance, where their approach is starting to look more like Chinese cyber sovereignty. But also countries like Vietnam, which is also an important partner for the US and Asia, but is not itself a liberal country. And lastly, just to your question, Leslie, about Europe, I think that Europe, and I spoke about allies, and I certainly included European allies in that, are an absolutely critical component of an openness strategy, because the fact is that an America that's in relative decline can't keep the world open on its own. And this is really only possible if we can rally our allies and partners, including and especially in Europe, to do this work with us. Europe, I think, will be the front line of pushing back against Russian attempts at closure, and that's a charge that Europe, I think, can in large part take up on its own. But also in these world ordering questions, like, will our European allies join us to back institutional reform to save organizations like the WTO or even the Security Council? Will they join with us to set new rules and norms to govern the internet and new technologies? Will they upgrade their defense strategies to protect the global commons? I mean, all of these are central questions, and the preferences for Europe should align with openness. And if the US can actually muster and lead, I think, a coalition of countries that includes Europe, that is our best hope for keeping the international system open and forestalling any bids for closure that might emerge.
Alex?
Yeah, thanks so much. So just a few things. So Hans, I think your 3 points about different kinds of liberalism roughly, not to minimize your point, roughly map onto what we sort of put out in the book, right? That is, the order itself is 3 components. One is this multilateral or intergovernmental form of order that takes place in various sort of institutions, the political liberalism as a principle of governance in most of those institutions, right? As well as things like human rights treaties, anti-corruption treaties that emphasize the individual, and so forth. And then economic liberalism, right? Whose parameters have shifted historically, right? Embedded liberalism of the post-World War II order is much different than the unbridled sort of financial liberalization in the 1990s. The point being that in the 1990s, there was a sense that all of these would reinforce each other, right? What Tom Wright has talked about, the convergence wager, right? And like we would go in the same direction in all these. And in fact, what we see is a tension between these different elements. So just to give one example, so when you have hedge fund billionaires in the US who owe billions of dollars in taxes, who are able to fund, right, alt-right and far right-wing populist movements who are bent on subverting the liberal order in Europe, that is an example of the two being in tension. I think Manafort is a great case. I think we should have like roundtables on what we already know. But another great example is Paul Manafort's DOJ appendix about how he set up these influence schemes with the Habsburg Group, PR companies, different lobbying organizations, all to project this image that Yanukovych's Ukraine was Western friendly, right? That is the tension there, I think, sort of, you know, in relief. So I absolutely agree with you in terms of having to differentiate out, and I think these tensions become more acute. I just want a couple of points of disagreement with Rebecca. Yeah, I think we need to be really careful about extrapolating out from what you are absolutely right is the growing Chinese-Russian power asymmetry, this idea that Russian ordering behaviors are inconsequential or in decline, right? So I think Russia has gone through, has actually, its foreign policy on wanting to rid the world, right, of the liberal international order has been relatively consistent over the last 15 years. And it's experimented in many different ways. In some ways, it's totally revealed itself to be ineffective, right? So trying to pay the Central Asian country Kyrgyzstan to get rid of the US military base, or trying to bribe Belarus to recognize the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It was, you know, it was exposed as not having the resources to do it. But I would argue in other ways, it's become a lot more efficient and effective, right? So sensing power vacuums, acting opportunistically, Syria, Ukraine, what's going on in Africa, Libya, Central African republics, sensing sort of the French lead that they have. So this is not to say that they're a world power on the magnitude of China, they're not. But in my view, it's precisely the asymmetry with Chinese power that will lead them to support Chinese ordering efforts, right? It's exactly because they don't want to confront the realities of a 3,000 mile border with China that they are willing to go all in on this sort of ordering, even if it has a Chinese characteristic. And, you know, maybe they wake up in 10, 15 years time and are like, oh my God, what have we done, right? Greater Eurasia actually meant sort of Greater China. But I think they're pretty sober about that, right? And this idea that somehow we can sort of bring them away. I'm not saying that you know, you're making that argument, but you know, some of the administration or affiliate administration had, I think it's just sort of folly. I think they've sort of picked their side, but together I think the ordering is significant. Illiberal order, regional organizations, does it matter? I think it depends on which one you look at, right? So for the SCO, one of the things that the SCO does, it has a common watch list of political opponents, right? Where these sort of lists, we don't know how the list is calculated. It's got 47 organizations, thousands of people. These are domestic political opponents. It's this log rolling, like you recognize your pet terrorist, separatist, and extremist, and we'll recognize yours. It's the same thing that the GCC does with its common watch list. There it extends to issues, I think, like common libel and so forth. So I think, you know, there are practices that make them illiberal. I think AIIB, depending on whether we look at it as part of liberal ordering economic sphere or the Chinese ordering economic sphere, can play a pivot role in both ways. Very final thing on Europe. Here, I think it matters, right? In the sense that, to me, the two main differences that you see in Trump versus what, kind of a Hillary Clinton administration might have been, Joe Biden administration, I think the number one thing on a Clinton agenda would have been confronting Brexit, right? And trying to manage its fallout and so forth. Whereas I think it's clear that, like, the perception that this is part of a illiberal nationalist tilt to the right was the common glue with the Trumpists. One. Two, maybe not acknowledged as one, I think there's a deep held belief amongst a lot of Trump's negotiators that international power is power. It's military power, it's relative. And if you strip everything out, alliances, European Union, multilateral, so forth, norms, all this kind of thing, you deal with countries one-on-one, you as the United States have an advantage, right? And that is, I think, one of the real drivers in bargaining dynamics, that you pick off the UK, you ram through a trade deal that is absolutely favorable, that the UK needs, right, to hedge against the EU. And that's the philosophy, right? It views liberal ordering infrastructure not as a power resource, but as a nuisance, or even an obstacle to asserting true power.
Okay, Dan.
I don't want to take up that much more time from what I hope are other questions. So just two bottom line things. The first is that, to underscore what Alex said, in our view, there are these three baskets of liberal ordering: economic, political, and what we call intergovernmental, multilateralism, that sort of aspect, right? The idea that there are liberal processes and practices for engaging in cooperation, adjudication of disputes. The one of those that when we talk about sort of threats to liberal order, the primary problem is in the political sphere, right? And it's the stripping out, both the stripping out of political rights protections and democratic aspects of international ordering and order from, or normative aspects from existing international institutions where the United States has kind of gone AWOL, right, and left things to the illiberal powers to kind of get their way in a lot of respects. And then in this big explosion of new liberal cooperative institutions that have the form, the multilateral liberalism, but lack that politically liberal content, right? And in some ways are actually, as Alex mentioned with the STO, expressly constituted to use liberal cooperation in that sense against political liberalism and political liberalization. So we have this weird world where liberal intergovernmentalism, multilateralism is doing pretty well, except for the United States' exit under the Trump administration from a lot of its activities. What I think has been extremely consequential when we talk about things like the pandemic. And then where economic liberalism is doing pretty well, but because of the particular kind of marriage of neoliberalism with decreasing political liberalization pressures, is generally taken the form of allowing the piggybacking of kleptocracy, corruption, oligarchy, right? So this form of liberalism that is actually quite corrosive, again, towards the politically liberal side. And that's, I think, the big problem that the United States now has to deal with is that it's been one of the major forces in driving a world that has turned certain liberalisms against one another. Right, and that's then where I would cut to the second point, which is that if the United States wants to achieve any of these things, particularly on the anti-corruption, protection of liberal democracy front, it has to work with the European Union. And the reason is simple, that the United States is the second largest consumer market in the world, but the US plus the EU is sometimes larger, it depends on the exchange rate. Right now, the US is, I think, larger. But if the US and the EU are able to harmonize certain things like anti-corruption regulations or pro-democracy kind of pressures, we're back to being the largest domestic consumer market in the world, the largest GDP bloc, and that's really how you get things, you get action on those fronts. So there are really good proposals floating around, for example, to take U.S. financial transparency, U.S. anti-money laundering regulations, which are better than what the EU has, and EU corporate transparency regulations, which are better what the U.S. has, and it's seeing if we can harmonize those kinds of regulatory environments to use standard setting and regulatory power to advance sort of openness in that sense. And I think this is an area where whether you're sort of in the version of this stuff that Alex and I support, or the slightly different but broadly similar version that Rebecca and Mira support, where you just have to have that cooperation. Now, where does Britain fit in? That's up to Britain, right? Britain's taken itself out of the one of the three economic great powers because it thinks, I guess, I don't know, it'll get better deals on its own. And so really now what's going to matter is how Britain is able to slot itself into that world. It would be better for Britain's bargaining leverage, right, if Trump remains in power and succeeds in undermining the EU further. But it's probably better for Britain's, I think, domestic interest and its democratic interests if it can live in a world where the US and the EU are accommodating, and Britain can figure out how to slot better back into that world while maintaining, I guess, whatever it got out of Brexit, national pride.
Yeah, okay. Just as Brexit wasn't universally accepted in Britain, Trump hasn't been universally accepted in the US. So these are really hard to, speak in holistic terms. We have three people with questions. Not a lot of time left. We're going to go a couple minutes over, but we'll try to keep it to time. Zachary, Gideon, and Elena. And if you could briefly introduce yourself, Zachary.
Hi there. Thanks very much. Zach Pakin here. I just obtained my PhD earlier this year in international relations from the University of Kent. I just want to thank all of you for an incredibly stimulating and very thoughtful conversation so far. And I very much appreciate the notion that we could sort of divide between, on the one hand, denser multilateralism that is being pushed by the likes of Russia and China, while at the same time they're also pushing the revenge of sovereignty. And so the mixed elements of liberalism that are surviving into the new order raises fundamental questions about, how liberal we can actually consider the future order to be. My question is for Rebecca. And just to push back, I really appreciate this distinction that you made, Rebecca, about on the one hand, this notion that the US should push back against those elements of Chinese or Russian actions that advance the notion of spheres of influence while also accommodating the natural outgrowth of the rise of Chinese power. But my question is it possible at this point in time, with the return of great power rivalry already, having already adopted a seemingly zero-sum characteristic and with very little trust remaining between major powers at this point, and with the norms that both sides advance seeming to be, to a large extent, very much zero-sum, and obviously in the context of great power rivalry, there's going to be a military component rooted on containment and deterrence. Can that balance actually be found? Or will there always be sort of a zero-sum further deterioration of international order that will be entrenched regardless of what sort of vision of world order the United States puts forward, simply because any form of vision that they're going to put forward, even the open world vision, will include an element of containment and not only an element of accommodation or cooperation?
Great. And Gideon Rochman, who has a great piece, if you haven't read it already, in today's FT, A New Cold War, Trump, Xi, and Escalating US-China Confrontation. Gideon, over to you.
Thank you for that plug. Actually, you might be relieved to know that my question's kind of more or less been answered by Alexander Dan. I'm just interested, possibly Rebecca might have something to add, because it's on the inevitable Brexit question, because Rebecca said that the only way to work on the open world was with the EU. And where does she see Brexit Britain fitting into that? Is it an adversary, or is it, as Dan suggested, really up to the British themselves to decide? Is there some way that, if it's a Biden administration, they can shape the choice so as to bring Britain back on board as part of all this?
And Elena, did you want to unmute? You've written a great question here. It's definitely one I'd love to hear the answer to. Are you with us?
Yes. Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm a recent graduate of IR from King's College. Thank you so much, everyone, for such a great discussion. I kind of wanted to go back to what you said about foreign grand strategy of the US and taking into future possibilities. I was wondering, do you think the US and Western countries could and should kind of confront the Chinese government in terms of human rights violations, especially in the light of the situation with the Chinese minorities such as the Uyghurs? And I was also wondering what should and could be the U.S. strategy in terms of Chinese confrontation, escalation of tensions with Taiwan, when in the past year the Western countries and the U.S. have been pretty silent with the situation in Hong Kong.
So who wants to take that last question? And whoever it is can go first. Alex, go for it.
That's actually all I'm going to address. So interestingly enough, we have a vote at the UN Human Rights Council on the camps in Xinjiang. And the vote was something like 22 to 53 the other way in terms of competing letters of whether to criticize or support China. And the 22 countries that spoke against in criticism of the camps, typical countries of the previous liberal world order. We have a map of this in the book, but the ones criticizing are from every continent on the world, and they not only support China's right to the camps, they also refer to China as the guardian of a human rights regime, right? So it's already happening, right, in terms of sort of the normative shift in areas where we sort of expect. We do have the Uyghur Rights Act, Policy Rights Act, which passed, and actually President Trump signed it. I think the implications are going to depend on how much we use sanctioning power, both against companies and individuals. I think as a Central Asianist, this creates an interesting potential spin of giving money and support for both Uyghur-related groups sort of in Central Asia, but also Central Asian co-nationals, especially Kazakhs, who have been caught up in the camps, right? And have actually, there's quite a spontaneous civil society putting the Kazakh government in a very difficult position vis-a-vis China on the fate of tens of thousands of Kazakhs who have gone through this camp. So unfortunately, what I see happening though is that the issue is being used in a very transactional way to bludgeon China on this new kind of rights issue. So in some ways, you know, we don't talk as much about promoting democracy anymore, or even human rights in general, but the Uyghurs really are sort of the cause at the moment in this sort of US-China competition.
Can I push you just a little bit further on this, Alex, just for 1 minute, to come back to something that Dan said at the end of his very initial remarks, the things that the US would have to do to tackle the problem of, say, transnational interference that's causing illiberalism in the US, make it harder to do the global commons, you know, provide the collective solutions to global commons problems. What's your response to that on the, you know, if you push hard on the camps, you push hard on human rights, what do you lose when it comes to cooperating with China?
Yeah, for sure. These are red lines for China, you know, in many cases. On the other hand, the line keeps getting pushed out in terms of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, right? And as we're finding out now, even in academia, right, where we have to secure sessions when we discuss China and Chinese related issues, or even accept papers from students writing on China because of these new domestic restrictions. So I think part of it is drawing lines in the sand over what's normatively acceptable for a, you know, liberal values set in terms of sort of, you know, promoting ideas and principles. So I think there has to be some sort of line somewhere. I agree about US credibility. I agree about the democracy promotion agenda became associated too much with regime change. But I think part of the change in conversation is not promoting values, but which values, right? The Department of Justice right now is promoting values in Central America, but it's, you know, the values it's promoting are more to do with, you know, religious freedom and different types of evangelical kinds of activities there and so forth, right? So there's Dan's talked about this a lot. There's a debate about which kind of West, right, should the US actually promote, and that is also getting caught up here.
Who wants to go next? Rebecca? You had a couple of questions just for you, I think.
Sure. I won't go into the human rights piece just out of deference to time. But let me start with Gideon. Gideon, thank you for your question, and I'm always an avid reader of your column, so it's nice to hear from you. So to your question about Brexit, I think that there's still ample role for the UK to play in an openness strategy, even in a world of Brexit. And here I would just say that there are so many different coalitions for different openness in different areas that I think will emerge over the next decade or so. And some of those may engage directly with the EU, but many of them will not. So in terms of setting new norms and new deterrence thresholds, let's say, in cyberspace, NATO is going to be a critical element of that. Obviously, still an organization in which the UK plays a very large role. The UK has increasingly participated in freedom of navigation operations overseas. Again, not something that necessarily has to flow through the EU, but to which Britain can absolutely contribute. And I also think that if you do see a Biden administration, there's going to be real emphasis on new forms of democratic multilateralism, whether that's the Summit of Democracies concept that he's talked about, whether that's a sort of D10, whether that's working through the OECD or the G7. I think there's real recognition that democratic allies and partners are a central component of, promoting American values and interests going forward, especially in a more competitive international environment, and that there will be a lot of different institutional forms, both formal and informal, that takes in practice. So I think that's good news from a UK perspective. Briefly to Zachary's question about whether this is just sort of inevitably zero-sum and inexorably competitive, the openness strategy and the open world concept doesn't actually rely upon China buying into it. In fact, it hedges against the likelihood that China will not. So this is a vision for how the United States can live alongside a China that is very powerful and also remains authoritarian. And what that means is that contrary to this notion of the liberal international order as a universal monolithic entity that we've all seen over the past 3 decades, future order is going to be more fragmented. It's going to vary in its membership and its scope. You're going to have different coalitions of countries that coalesce around certain technological norms, like whether that's cyber sovereignty or more democratic notion of internet governance and data governance, another area where the US can and must collaborate with European allies who've been real standard makers in this area. You're going to have different coalitions that coalesce around the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So this is a highly variegated order. And what that means is that China may itself partake in some of it. There may be some forms of cooperation that the US and China are able to achieve, but that is going to depend on the existence of mutual interests. And I think this gets back to, in some ways, where Dan started off with his remarks, which is that, there are trade-offs. And there's a really interesting set of questions around, if our goal is climate cooperation with Beijing, what should we be willing to trade in order to get it? And one of the core arguments of the openness strategy is that there's a certain certain set of Chinese behaviors that are Chinese attempts to establish hierarchical dominance and closure, whether in its region or otherwise, that we should not be willing to trade, even for something as important as climate cooperation.
Sorry, had a moment of not being able to unmute. Can you, in a sentence maybe or two, before we turn to Dan, can you say exactly, and I guess that's probably not fair, but what would you trade and what wouldn't you trade to get climate cooperation with China?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I do think that the US has a lot of coercive leverage that it can use. So in some ways it can trade sort of harmony with China in favor of a greater willingness, for example, to use economic sanctions to enforce climate commitments. I think a lot is really going to depend on what the successor to the Paris Agreement, if there is a successor, if the US rejoins the Paris Agreement, what that looks like, what kind of national commitments it entails, and what kind of enforcement mechanisms. But certainly one way that the US can exert additional outside-in pressure on China is by reaching new high standards, including high environmental and climate standards trade agreements in the region that can really kind of elevate all of Asia in terms of what its climate commitments are, and therefore create more enforceable mechanisms to push back against countries like China if they don't live up to their emission standards. But again, it's about mutual interest. There's not a whole lot I think that the US can do to fundamentally change China's calculus on climate. In many ways, it is more forward-leaning than where the US is right now, but there are certainly barriers, including all the coal plants that it's building via BRI. So I think this is a critical area of cooperation and one where additional American engagement can hopefully tilt things in the right direction.
Okay, I'm going to come to Dan on these questions. Can you also give us your response or your view in answering these questions on Biden's proposal for a summit of democracies? And then we're going to read out this last question and let Alex come in on the climate question on the Summit of Democracies, and then we'll close. Unless somebody else has a really pressing question, because we've already gone over. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I wish I had like strong ready-made views. We've been batting around leagues of democracies and summits of democracies for decades. It seems to be one of those things that's now cotton on, that it's one of those things that people across the spectrum have sort of started to go all in on. So I guess it's gonna like happen maybe, right? I mean, I don't really fully, yeah, like you need more cooperation among those countries that remain liberal democracies to potentially see if they can agree on the fundamental good of protecting liberal democracy. That's great. I guess maybe investing more status into being a liberal democracy isn't a bad thing. Although, I don't exactly know what you get out of this that you don't get out of the G7 already, but whatever. My question with these things always is what counts as a liberal democracy and what doesn't, right? So does Poland get invited? Does Hungary get invited? Right, to a summit of liberal democracies? And it seems to me that that's, if we get a new government in Italy that is Liga focused and it gets even more kind of reactionary populist, is that, goes down that route, do they belong in the summit of democracies? I mean, this is the sort of fundamental problem with a lot of these proposals, is that in practice, what counts as a democracy turns out to be sort of strategic, and it turns out to be driven by factors that aren't necessarily substantially as democratic. But, you know, whatever. I mean, I guess it's fine. I mean, it's not bad to have more diplomatic initiatives. It's only bad if you scope them in ways that make you look idiotic or hypocritical or that denudiate their value, right? And so the devil's always in the details. Beyond this, I don't really have much to add to anything that everybody said. I'd rather see as many questions as we can squeeze in or additional comments. So.
Okay, let's take this last question from, actually, would you like to speak, Afag? And I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Are you on the call still?
Hello, yes.
Hi.
Is my voice
I'm
coming
going to
through?
let you state your question, and I think you have the last question.
Okay, thank you. So there's arguably a power vacuum in Southeast Asia, and Russia and China and the UAE to an extent are the leading players in this region right now. However, they have different strategic visions for that region. So do you think that the US will soon capitalize on this power vacuum and the growing anti-EU sentiment, particularly in countries like Serbia, to exert its influence and propose a new initiative that restricts the Russian-Chinese influence in the region?
Yeah, I mean, just in the spirit of your question, I think, you know, the Balkans are a really, you know, good example, because you said Serbia, right? A really good example of shifts in this world, right? And my kind of favorite anecdote in this realm is that RFE-RL poll of Serbian citizens, which is the leading provider of foreign aid to Serbia. And this is sort of conducted in the fall, right? And a plurality of respondents, over 40%, said, well, China, of course. China's the leading provider of sort of, you know, foreign aid to Serbia. And this is, you know, an impression that got reinforced by COVID and this idea that China was going to give emergency sort of medical goods. Well, of course, by far, over 90% of foreign aid in Serbia is delivered by the European Union, right? And yet the Serbian public was not getting that message. And it's probably a combination of different information and disinformation spheres, right? Where, you know, Russia and China are operating that information space. It's a function of populist politicians playing up the importance of engaging with China and Russia. Set aside the values, just give us the stuff. We have to be sovereign and pragmatic, right? It's also sort of an example of that. Plus, I think, you know, general fatigue and malaise with the outcomes of, you know, EU integration or lack integration of the Euro-Atlantic sphere. So I think, you know, sometimes perceptions are more dire than the actual sort of objective reality. And this is, you know, one of those examples. But I do think on this, you know, these anniversaries of these big events in the Balkans, like, you know, Dayton and so forth, you know, it's well worth checking just how different of a kind of a geopolitical circumstance we are in these kinds of third regions than we were in the mid-90s.
I would like to add to that or add a final comment before we close. Dan, Rebecca?
Yeah, I just have one thing I won't preface it with I have one thing to say. It'll be short because who knows what will actually happen if I do that. But, but the key thing I would say is that I don't have something to say about the Balkans in particular, but I do think that the dynamics of the Balkans illustrate a broader set of interesting issues for us. So obviously in the Serbia case, you have, you know, sort of, you can think about 3 active powers, 4 active powers running around with various kinds of aid and diplomatic packages, the EU, the United States, Russia, and China. And so that very much is kind of, you know, this, I think Alex and Rebecca, most everybody, I hope, or a lot of people, we agree, and I think, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, and I think a lot of people agree that this is sort of the future, right? That the consequence of the United States being still probably the world's most powerful state, but in a world of multiple great powers, is that you're more likely to see this kind of competition. This is what Alex, this kind of competition, this type of potential bidding, or the ability, just the fact that there might be multiple suitors who sometimes might be additive or sometimes might be zero sum in their relations. That's just kind of like where we are now. The thing I would say that is interesting about the Balkans and the contrast between Serbia and the most recent developments we've seen with China and the Czech Republic and elsewhere is that there's been a presumption, a kind of sky is falling, great power competition presumption when this happens that, you know, Ermagard, if the US has any competition at all for the loyalties of any states that we care about, then, or you might say the same thing for the EU, then the world is transformed, it's all over. We have to pull out all the stops. And what in fact happens historically, and in fact is happening now, is that sometimes countries go down, go and they get a bunch of Chinese aid, or they go to a bunch of Chinese promises, and you know what? At the end of the day, it's not all that great, right? The deal isn't all that awesome or excellent. There are negative externalities. Maybe at the end of the day, you wind up nationalizing those ports in 5 or 10 years that everybody's worried that the Chinese have locked down forever. Maybe you don't like the fact that turns out that they bought off the politicians to make it happen, and all of a sudden you're dealing with massive debts that are a result of Chinese sort of driven corruption. Sometimes, so the point is just that again, in these situations, sometimes the US will do well, sometimes the US will do poorly. Sometimes it's okay to kind of lose in the short term, because in the long term, maybe you'll have the more attractive deal. And so part of acclimating to this world is an understanding that these things can be in flux, that ultimately not every game is worth the candle. And that sometimes, your best bet, I think the best bet for the United States is to say, here's what we have to offer. We think it's a pretty good deal. If you want to take it, right? If you don't, go somewhere else, and then come back to us if those debts are called in a way that makes you uncomfortable, right? In other words, the United States needs to get used to the idea that it can do some rope-a-dope, that it can be a little bit more relaxed about some of these relationships. And it's already seeing evidence that when the initial wave of panic subsides, the initial wave of interest subsides, that even though we're going to live in a world where China will have more influence, Russia will have more influence, other powers will have more influence, that doesn't mean that, sort of the sky is necessarily falling everywhere all the time. So that's what I want to say about that.
And Rebecca, last line to you. I think you have to read the comment on your cat, Dan, from Gideon, your cat has done well. The cameo worked. I'm glad we staged that in advance.
I have no animals to offer, only small children who are in another room. But I would just say that I agree with Dan. I think this raises a really interesting set of questions about what it does look like to be in a genuinely competitive field. And what the US needs to do, I think, is to identify those domains, whether that's development assistance, whether that's building physical infrastructure or digital infrastructure that matter the most to us strategically. We need to identify those regions, whether that be the Balkans or the Western Hemisphere, that matter to us most strategically. And in those areas, we need to work to ensure market diversity, which is to say that there is an alternative to Russia or China. Even if those states sometimes nevertheless do choose Russia or China, we don't want them to win out by default where it matters. And there are going to be two groups that are really essential to doing that successfully. One is like-minded allies and partners, whether that's Japan providing a BRI alternative or the EU giving lots of aid to Serbia, as Alex just discussed. And also, frankly, the American private sector, because so many of these types of initiatives are going to require public-private partnerships that put American companies to work overseas, and often join American companies with foreign companies, for example, in developing a true 5G alternative to China, which is not something that the American tech sector can do on its own. So those, I would say, are the policy priorities going forward in order to bring about a world that is open because it is diverse and competitive, and therefore not dominated by another country that has different interests and values than the ones we're trying to espouse.
I'd say one thing, actually, I'm sorry, because Rebecca's really excellent comments made me think about this, and I'd sort of lost it. One of the big problems, it's very easy for all of us to sit up, and for Americans in general, other people to talk about working with allies or all that sort of stuff, because we should, right? That's awesome. That's excellent. The problem is, and I think that's something that's addressed in all of our books, so this isn't a problem, I think, with any of the panelists per se, is that a lot of the threats to the open world, liberal democracy, et cetera, are coming from within the house, right? They're not external threats, right? Russia is certainly doing is sort of trying to kind of Russia, for example, is not causing illiberal reactionary movements in the West. It's trying to throw them an assist, or it's trying to insert themselves as a broker. But it's not, it's much more kind of a set of problems about failures in the West itself, right? And it's then in backlashes in political movements and dynamics in the West itself. And that means that it's not always going to be moving forward if we think that those are the really core challenges, if we think this is sort of like the late 20s or whatever is our analogy. It's not going to mean necessarily, it's going to require a very different and potentially problematic and potentially maybe not worth it. I mean, I'm not sure what the trade-off is, but Alex mentioned already that one of the things we've seen in the Trump administration is an attempt to put its thumbs on the scales for right-wing reactionary movements in Europe, right? To throw support to the AfD or to far-right movements or even more quote-unquote mainstream right movements that aren't center-right in the Netherlands, to really punish Merkel's Germany and go all in on law and justice in Poland, throwing a lot of goodies and security kind of things at Poland without demanding anything in terms of domestic reform. And so the problem for any, assuming we are not run by a Trumpist in the future, right? Assuming that there is that the United States sort of has new government in power, the problem that presidents like Biden are going to face is the question of, do they also put their thumbs in the scale, right? Do they intervene in the affairs of more or less democratic allies to support liberal interests, and whether that's even a good strategy or a strategy more likely to cause blowback. And so there's this real fundamental problem we face here, which is that if we say that there's a primary existential or security interest in maintaining liberal democratic regimes in a world in which the United States and its allies are interdependent governmentally and politically, does that mean that the United States starts to engage, work together with our liberal democratic allies to tilt the scales politically? Do we look at this as, the United States and the United Kingdom and a couple other countries looking out at an increasingly fascist or increasingly reactionary world and taking the kind of steps that we think probably should have been taken in the 20s before things metastasized, right? And those are really difficult, challenging problems, and they're problems that actually raise all sorts of difficulties, because they raise issues about these bidding wars and who's more threatening to sovereignty. They raise issues about how much we want openness as a sort of general kind of, let's have liberal economic and political flows, and how much what we want is openness within a sphere that has to be closed off, right? Or has to be there has to be sort of things that we now regard as sort of illiberal steps in the support of liberalism. And those are thorny problems that I don't think there's a good answer to, but they're the kind of problems we have to start thinking very seriously about if we want to preserve liberal democratic values and systems of government. Thank
you for that, because I think you've certainly put the big question, as I see it, on the table, something that I'm trying to work on right now. We don't usually go 25 minutes over, but I think it was foolish, certainly of me, to think that we were ever going to do this in an hour. The fact that everybody's, so many people have stayed tells you that it's a conversation that we all have wanted to have. It feels a little bit surreal because, we all know that we're hanging on a cliff, not really knowing which direction the US is headed. And for all the arguments about structure, we all know that the election matters a heck of a lot. Certainly feels like it matters a lot sitting over here, and I'm sure it feels like it matters a lot sitting where you're sitting. But this is tremendous. Read, if you haven't read, Rebecca and Mira's book, Alex and Dan's, but also all of their work. It's really tremendous. And the three of you, if you haven't read Gideon's piece today, make sure you read the last two paragraphs in particular. Really interesting argument. So we'll do this again. I think we should do this again after January 20th, regardless of the result, because I think it's actually going to be really important to revisit the conversation. You can see people thanking you in the chat. The cat was great, but really thank you so much for doing this. And we'll share the recording with all of you if you want to reflect on what was said. So have a great evening. And
that would be great. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great to see everyone. Yeah.